This is a production of Cornell University.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. I'd also like to say that I'm known as the Indiana Jones of ancient fermented beverages and beer, wine, etc. So I think this is a topic that sort of appeals to everybody. And over the course of the last 20 years, a lot of my research now has been dedicated to this. And to really understand ancient fermented beverages, you also have to test some modern ones. So this is a nice side part to my job, which takes me around the world, actually. And we do have, and I'm going to be discussing, ancient wine primarily in the Middle East. And as you see here, we've got a fresco from Egypt, which dates back to the New Kingdom period, but actually we have examples of this going back into the Old Kingdom period. So from about 2700 BC down to the end of the Egyptian dynasties, we have depictions like this in the tombs. And the purpose of this was to provide lots of wine for the deceased, something that is still a part of our sort of paradise idea in our Western religions, even Islam. But you can see how detailed some of the evidence is from these Egyptian frescoes, which we have nothing like it really anywhere else in the ancient world. I mean, you have to really come down to the Roman period before you start to, pick up depictions of some of the features of winemaking. And these can be, considered sort of stock motifs that get repeated over and over again. So it doesn't include all the details of the winemaking, but I mean, right away you can see that they're training the vines, very carefully to keep the sun exposure down in the Nile Delta, and we see some of the stomping out of the grapes where they're holding grapevines and usually singing a song to the snake goddess, who's associated with grapes and wine. And then you see this red must coming out at the bottom here, which suggests, and often you see just a red. You never see a white coming out. So this is what's given people the idea that maybe it's red wine, principally, that ancient people would have drunk. I happen to disagree with that. I think it was very select group maybe that had white wines, because it's a very small percentage of the grapes have that albino mutation, and we do have evidence I'll be coming to that suggests that white wine was drunk as well. So then the juice was put into these jars, and these are the famous Canaanite jars or amphoras, and the fermentation is actually carried out in those vessels, and then you had clay stoppers that were put on and stamped with the name of the king. Often at later periods you have information about where the winery is located, even the name of the vintner. So you've got like the first wine labels here that you're looking at. And you can, in some cases, you can give a very exact date. Now, they don't put a lot of information about the quality of the wine. If you want tasting notes, about all it goes as far as saying good, very, very good. And that's about the extent of it. But how did I get involved in studying ancient wine? And it was kind of a circuitous route, like you've already suggested. Was taking chemistry, and I minored in English here at Cornell, and I am a townie, so I have great affection for this town, actually, and I went to high school here, and it was during high school that I sort of, as I look back on it now, is where I sort of got my first impetus maybe to pick up wine studies, because when I was 16 years old, we went off to Germany, and for about 2 months, traveling, bicycling around, and we soon discovered that beer was less expensive than Coca-Cola, so we started drinking lots of beer. And the first night, actually, that we were in Germany, this is a long time ago, we had dinner with a chemistry professor here who was a Nobel laureate. So that was a nice way to start out, at least getting some fermented beverages on the beer side. Then 10 years after that, I came back to Germany, and I picked grapes on the Mosel River. And that was quite an experience. Going along the very steep slopes like you see here, it's shaly, and I really discovered what a vintage was at that time too, because the first night the vintner took us down, or he went into a small room and he would go down in his cellar and come up with one wine after another, and he would cover the label and say, okay, what year is that? And at first, I had no clue in the world, what year it was. And but by the end of the night, after we had maybe 10 bottles of wine among 5 people, and I was totally, gone, we could really say, 1959 was a great year, 69 was terrible, and the year that we picked there was 1971, which turned out to be the vintage of the century in the Mosel. Well, then I came back, several years ago and went to the Constantin Frank winery, and looked at the Riesling grapes growing down the steep slopes, and I suppose sort of a similar geology too with the shale, and not quite as steep maybe as the Mosel, but it reminded me right away. I mean, here we've got a direct connection in terms of the grape varietal, the geology, and the type of grape, and so on. That's and the wines that are produced in this region are quite comparable. And as Alan has already mentioned, I have written a couple of books on this subject. One was Ancient Wine, and the most recent one is Uncorking the Past, where what I attempt to do in this most recent book is not just talk about wine, but fermented beverages in general. And I try to bring together all the various strands of evidence that we have. Archaeology, I was trained as an archaeologist, so I can assess that information. I was also trained as a chemist and, took, like you say, brain research, neurochemistry, and so forth. So I'm interested in doing scientific analyses of residues that might tell us something about the contents of the vessel. And then we have ancient texts and art. I've already shown some artwork from Egypt. You also see here another funerary stela, probably from Amarna, around 1350 BC, the time of King Tut, which is intriguing because, and this is on the cover of the book, it's intriguing because we have a Semite, as shown by the beard, drinking out of an amphora, which usually would contain wine, but in this case using a drinking tube, which is more usually reserved for beer. Because in beer drinking, we have many examples around the world of this. Straws are generally the way that you would drink it. You would do the fermentation in the jar, and then you've got lots of gunk and so on coming up to the surface, and you just put your drinking tube through all that gunk down to the precious liquid. And then you have to have some familiarity, too, with textual evidence. I often have to turn to my Egyptian colleagues, like Jim Weinstein is here in the audience, or others who maybe know the Egyptian texts very well, or it could be Akkadian texts. But I took smatterings of all of these, and so I know Semitic languages pretty well, and that helps in ferreting out some of the ancient evidence, too. Again, you have to be very careful with textual evidence because it can be misleading at times, and a lot of times you don't know the meanings of certain words. Then you have the modern situation, ethnography, where it may give you clues about what the past was and how beverages were made. So you have to assess that evidence. And finally, experimental archaeology, which we've taken quite a ways because when we've discovered some of these ancient beverages, we've been able to recreate them. You take all these clues together and try to get a composite picture of what that beverage would have been, and then you'd like to find out if it really tastes any good, or how would you go about making it. And so we've worked principally with a brewery. I'm not sure how familiar this will be to people here in the audience, but called Dogfish Head Brewery, which is the fastest growing microbrewery, in fact, in the United States. It's located in Delaware. And so we've done a whole series of experiments, and some of these are available commercially. In fact, if you come to the tasting this afternoon, the reception at 4:30, you'll get to taste the next beverage that I'll just briefly talk about. As far as ethnography, I'm also going to be coming back to the evidence for pottery being used to make wine in Georgia and Armenia, principally. I mean, Georgia is the one that claims to have this long tradition, so I'll be touching on that too. So this is the label for our recreation of the beverage that came from the Midas tumulus. That's the actual name of a very large mound that's located at the site of Gordion in central Turkey. And Gordion was the capital of the Phrygians, and the dating, according to dendrochronology and radiocarbon dating and so forth, is about 740 to 700, which fits with the textual evidence that we have for the tomb belonging either to Midas, who's a little bit later, or his father, Gordius. But it's definitely a royal tomb. It has the largest Iron Age drinking set that's ever been found. And in the drinking set were residue that came back to the University of Pennsylvania, who did the excavation, and they sat in an archive just 2 floors above my lab for 40 years, and they were still in the original paper bags, the residues. And so this is like the easiest excavation I was ever on. I just had to walk up 2 flights of stairs, collect my samples, and come back down. But you'll see here it has this is the golden thumbprint of Midas, the touch of gold. But we put in this recreation from dogfish Muscat grapes, because we do have genetic evidence of that being a very early cultivar in the Near East. Then barley malt, honey. Now, we didn't know what the bittering agent was. We couldn't use hops because that comes much, much later. So I suggested, well, Turkey is famous for its saffron, and it has a very beautiful aroma and taste, so why don't we go with that? Well, this turned out to be the most expensive spice in the world, too. So this is the most expensive mixed beverage, or you could call this a Phrygian grog, that Sam Calagione, the owner of Dogfish, had ever made. It turned out very well. That's all I can say. And if you come at fourth, it's won lots of gold medals appropriately, and it did show us that maybe ancient people knew a little bit more about beverages than we thought. Because when we first got this combination of ingredients, wine, beer, and mead, we said, well, what in the world? I mean, would you mix wine and beer together? Well, it turns out this is a fairly common phenomenon all around the world. You take whatever fermentable sugars you've got and ferment it. And also adding different spices or herbs becomes very important in terms of ancient medicine, because many of the pharmacopoeias, like of Egypt, India, China, and so forth, going back quite early, a lot of times the way you get an herb into solution is in an alcoholic beverage. It could be wine or beer, or something else, a mixed beverage like this, and you would try to treat different diseases that way. Now, the first vessel that we worked on came from about 3500 BC that we were able to identify a resinated wine, and I'll be coming back to some of the chemical data for this. But this was out at our, see, I always have to wear my tie to be sure that I have this continuity of tradition. The red tie actually started to flay up here, so now I've switched over to the blue tie. This is Virginia Badler, who was able to bring this very large jar from the Chalcolithic period, and we were able to sample it and analyze it. And as I say, it turned out to be a resinated wine inside this jar. We'd already had success with ancient organic materials like royal purple, so, and I, like I say, had gone and picked grapes. My associate came from a German wine family, and so we were both very interested, in doing studies of ancient wine. And this was at the conference that we had on the origins and ancient history of wine back in 1991. That kind of propelled, our research after that, and we brought together, people from all different fields, mainly Davis people, like in viticulture and enology, Vernon Singleton, Harold Omo, but also DNA specialists, archaeobotanists, historians, people that had never really been in the same room together, but were writing about wine, and we all interchanged ideas, and it This was powered by having maybe 3 or 4 wines at lunch every day and 5 or 6 in the evening. So it was a true symposium, you could say. And then we went back, we started thinking, well, could we go back into an earlier period and get some evidence for ancient wine? Well, the period that seemed most important and possible for doing that would be the Neolithic period, when you have all the different plants and animals being domesticated, people are settling down, but you also have the first pottery that's produced, say around 6000 BC in the Near East. Turns out in China it goes back to 13,000 BC, so we have more prospects actually for China now, but I'm not going to talk about that. But the pottery is important because it absorbs liquids, and that those liquids then get bound up in the ionic structure of the clay. And so if you have a very good preservation, if you're out in the desert of Egypt, let's say, or underwater where there's not too much oxygen, in some cases, high up in the Alps, you might be able to get an organic sample that then you could extract with different kinds of solvents like chloroform, methanol is what we usually use, and do an analysis. So this, when I came back to the University of Pennsylvania Museum, I just asked a Neolithic archaeologist, Mary Voigt, if she knew of any samples that might be prospectively good that we could try analyzing. And she said, well, the site she'd excavated in Iran, and the first vessel we analyzed is also from Iran, Haji Firuz, which dates back to this period, a couple thousand years earlier, had some yellowish residues on the inside of some of the sherds of fairly large jars. So here we see what one of the jars looks like. There were 6 of these lined up in a kitchen in just an ordinary house, and they were partly buried in the clay floor. And you had about 50 liters of wine altogether in this house. And so when they first found this back in 1968, they'd done some analyses to try to determine what that yellow residue was. But the techniques or the availability of chemists maybe who had some very sophisticated instruments wasn't available, so they really couldn't get very far with it. They thought the yellowish color maybe suggested yogurt or some milk product. But then we dug these out of storage again, and should also point out that there were clay stoppers that were had fallen down close to these vessels, which are the same width as the mouth, which is a very important indication that they're trying to seal up. And also this mouth, which is fairly tall for the period and narrow, would be intended for a liquid. So we had samples that we were able to get out of the University of Pennsylvania storeroom that looked like this, and you can see the yellowish residue here. This is only about 3 inches in height. And then we started doing our analysis. For the chemically challenged among you, I don't know, but we can talk about this later this afternoon too. I'm not going to go into all the details of this, but we're looking mainly for tartaric acid, because in the Middle East, this acid is found in large quantity only in grapes. So if we can identify tartaric acid, then we have a marker compound, a biomarker, a fingerprint compound that we can then use to argue that it is a grape product. Now, it could be grape juice, it could be wine, it could be vinegar. If the fermentation keeps going along. In the Middle East, where you have fairly high temperatures, though, if you have a liquid, the juice has been expressed from the grapes and put into a vessel like the Haji Firuz jar, it's going to have yeast on some of the grapes that are going to start fermenting with that higher temperature in the first day or so. So it's pretty hard to keep it from keeping grape juice, unless you were to boil it down and make some concentrate. So it goes to wine, And then the question is, well, does it keep going to vinegar? And our argument there is when you have a stopper like that that's intended to act like clay, really, because especially if you put it on its side, and we do have evidence some of the jars were put on their side, the juice would get absorbed into the raw clay and expand a little bit and keep oxygen from getting in. And the other thing we were able to detect was tree resin had been added to this wine, as well as the earlier one I talked about from Godin Tepe later in time. But these are generally pine resin or terebinth resin that are added to prevent oxidation. And we know from later periods, such as the Roman times, that one of the principal ways of preserving wine was to add a tree resin. And they said humans spent more time, Pliny the Elder, if you read his book, Natural History, he has a whole discussion of how to preserve wine, and he says that humans have spent more time trying to figure out how to preserve wine than just about any other activity. It's been a constant theme, I guess. So we use, techniques like infrared spectrometry, but our preferred method right now for picking up tartaric acid is tandem liquid chromatography using two mass spectrometer. So it would be a tandem LC mass spec that we get, fragments that we're able to we're able to determine that tartaric acid is present. We're working with some other techniques as well, and then we typically do gas chromatography mass spectrometry too, to identify any other additives, and together you put together a picture of what the residue's composition would have been. So we have wine, found very early in Iran, of all places, going back to 5400 BC, the Neolithic. But that gets you thinking, well, would we ever have any evidence that goes back even earlier? And unfortunately, when you get back into the Paleolithic period, the containers, we don't have pottery containers. So we don't have the sort of containers that are going to preserve the ancient organics that we're interested in. They probably would have used wine skins or hollowed out wood, or maybe used a crevice in the rock. But we can assume by, say, looking at Africa today even, you've got a continent that has numerous peoples, speaking all different languages and so on. But one commonality is they all seem to have a fermented beverage that's right at the center of their culture. So, from birth all the way to death, with celebrations and what have you, they will be making a fermented beverage. It could be millet or sorghum beer or palm wine, where you take the sap from a palm tree, or it could be bananas that are fermented, but it is a focus of almost all cultures that you find in Africa. And why is that significant? Well, if we came from Africa originally, and we came out of Africa, 100,000 years ago, this suggests that we probably were already pretty focused in on certain fermented beverages. And you can make a biological argument in this regard too, I'll be coming to. So here we've got our primitive ancestor who is very visually oriented, as we all are, and he would spot some high sugar fruit, and this maybe looks like kumquats or whatever. But let's say you're moving out of Africa up the Eastern Mediterranean. The first place where you would see the wild Vitis vinifera is maybe Lebanon, because the wild Vitis vinifera does not grow south into Egypt. So the person is coming up, they're interested in these fruits, and they start to pluck them, put them into their primitive container, and they leave them there for a few days, and the weight of the fruit above will be pressing down on the fruit below, and you get juice coming out. And you can assume that then fermentation is probably occurring in these very primitive containers. And so the human, or the primate, comes down and, tastes the liquid, smells it, and maybe drinks a fair amount of it and gets, a whole new sensory experience along with a mind-altering experience that I think they would remember, and they would come back to it. And so the only problem, though, is that their primitive container, they couldn't preserve the beverage. So you might call this a Stone Age Beaujolais Nouveau. Or I put sour ale in here, too, because we do have enzymes in our saliva that can break down carbohydrates into sugar that's fermentable, so that you can also be exploiting all different kinds of chewing of grains, stalks, any sort of high carbohydrate source by chewing, spitting it out, and waiting for an insect to bring some yeast by to get the fermentation going. But since they couldn't preserve it, you had to drink it quite fast. And so, we get into the whole discussion, of how alcohol really is part of life on this planet. I mean, if maybe the earliest energy system was a fermentation system, and maybe the first biotechnology of humans was fermenting beverages. So, all the way from the fruit fly on up to the elephant, they all are attracted to sugar and alcohol. And it goes beyond that. I mean, we've got, enzymes in our livers that break down alcohol into energy. And an alcoholic beverage is actually safer than drinking water because the alcohol kills microorganisms. So people that drank a fermented beverage probably live longer, reproduce more. So it has that going for it. And then, as these gentlemen here gathered around their watering hole in some primitive times show, it also brings people together. So it provides a social lubrication where people, start to break down their inhibitions and open up to each other. It, has the medical effect that I already mentioned, where you can put different herbs into solution. And if you were only living 25 years, you would be on the lookout for any herbs in your environment that you could dissolve into an alcoholic beverage and perhaps get some relief, from pain, or maybe even lower your cholesterol. But I don't think they thought about that too much. But I think the really important aspect of fermentation is the mind-altering effect. And they couldn't see the yeast. This is a magnified view of the yeast budding, Saccharomyces cerevisiae. But they could observe its effects. So here you've got the carbon dioxide roiling off the surface of the liquid that's fermenting, and you're also getting alcohol produced at the same time. So they would see that, and they would say, there's some sort of outside force, it seems, at work here. And if you did the fermentation in a vessel like the Haji Firouz jar, and you have all this carbon dioxide evolving and starting to shake things around, you might actually see the jar itself start to move. And, and that would be kind of amazing to these people. And so you can then begin to understand why fermented beverages become the center of religions. So even in our Western religions, wine is important to Judaism and Christianity, but like the African cultures I mentioned too. So it just is working on so many different levels, biologically, socially, medically, and religiously. I think this is why, despite what, the after effects of prohibition, of all the negatives that you hear, there is this positive side that I think has to be brought out. Of course, Mondavi tried to put it on his label that, wine was really the mark of civilization, and the alcohol, tobacco, firearm people said, nope, you can't put any positives there. It's strictly forbidden. So we've got this sort of backdrop in the Paleolithic period that we can surmise that fermented beverages are important, but we don't have the actual chemical evidence for that yet. But then the Neolithic is when we first get the pottery, and I've mentioned the Haji Firuz jar, but there's other evidence that we're still working on that in different parts of the mountainous Near East, like Georgia, up in the Caucasus, where we do have evidence of either artistically, some suggestive chemical evidence, which we're still working on, of sherds like this. And what's interesting about these sherds is that they do have motifs on them that might suggest grape clusters. And maybe this is a person, the stick figure, that's arms up in the air, kind of dancing around at some festival. And if we go back even earlier, before pottery, we have chlorite, vessels that are made out of chlorite that are very absorbent. And again, we've gotten lots of ancient organics from these, but we still are not convinced what the beverages are or whether it's wine. But again, they have these sort of celebratory scenes, and in this case, the man and woman are dancing with a turtle. But unfortunately, these sherds from Georgia usually went through a very intense hydrochloric acid bath, and so that we get out very small amounts of residue, and it's quite problematic. You get a lot of your ancient organic material, which isn't huge to begin with. The Midas residue I talked about before, I mean, we had literally pounds of residue. But here, we might be down at the milligram level, and it starts to get a little iffy at that point. In Georgia, too, we also have evidence of grape seeds quite early. And the way that these are usually distinguished, at least on a visual botanical level, is that the domesticated grape seed is a little bit shorter and broader, and then the wild grape, Vitis vinifera, the other way around. So the wild is shorter and broader, and the domesticated, which is going to be the hermaphrodite grape, is generally longer and narrower. And we do have wild grapes, at sites, throughout the mountainous area of the Near East. So they generally, fit into this wild type. The problem, if you have enough samples of grape seeds to work with, you can make some sort of statistical argument, but the two distributions actually overlap quite a bit. So it's sometimes a problem, and in some cases, grape cultivars like Pinot Noir actually have the form of the wild grape pip. So, you just have to be a little cautious about this, and this is where DNA ultimately is going to be really important. Now, this was the viticulturalist who had been working on grapes from one of these Neolithic sites, Revaz Ramishvili, and we're in Tbilisi, where they had a whole set of cultivars from Georgia that grew at the experimental station there. And he said, well, we have this very early site in Georgia called Shulaveri, and the grape pips are all the domesticated, long, narrow type. And we're talking about only 5 or 6 pips. And I said, well, wouldn't it be nice to do some DNA work on these? And he said, well, he had to, sort of went out of the room and had to think about it, came back, he said, no, he didn't really think that was, because we'd have to destroy the grape seed. And I said, well, it would be for the cause of science. We would find out whether we have a domesticated or a wild grape, perhaps. And he left the room again, and he came back, and he agreed. Okay, he's going to give me 1 pip. So I have this 1 pip still in my lab waiting to be analyzed once the DNA techniques have been worked out. Especially the extraction of ancient DNA from grapes is difficult. But in true Georgian fashion, because Georgia culture is totally centered around wine. I don't know if anybody here has been to Georgia, but every meal you've got a person that's picked out as a toastmaster who does all the toasts, and the toasts just go on and on and on. So he brought out a nice Muscat Alexandruli to celebrate the handing over of this 1 grape pip, which is still in my storage room at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. But now, what is the domestication of the grape? I mean, what's important about it? Well, it's because it's a hermaphrodite, which has the male and female on the same flower, and so you don't have to worry about insects, transferring the pollen, I mean, or wind, and you get much more predictability as far as fruitfulness, and you see a lot more fruit. And I guess in some cases, people say that the clusters of the grapes are larger too. So, it's a pretty small set of organs here, the pistil and the stamens and so forth. You need a sort of magnifying glass to, see if you've got the hermaphrodite or just the female wild plant or the male wild plant. So how did humans ever determine this? Because Vitis vinifera is the only grape species in the world that was ever domesticated. We have maybe 20, 25 species here in North America, the same number in China, but so far there's no evidence that any of those were ever domesticated. It was just Vitis vinifera. And so, maybe it's a little more difficult to figure out, when you've got a hermaphrodite or not. And and you have the further problem, okay, maybe once you select out the hermaphrodite by seeing the large size and a lot of fruit, is how do you perpetuate that? The seeds are too variable, so they're not going to give another hermaphrodite, and you would have to know some horticultural techniques. I mean, that's sort of the assumption that is built into this. So you know how to transplant grapevines or run it under the ground, layering, to have the grapevine come up in another place and multiply it that way. But it really does assume a lot of understanding of what is going on, not scientifically obviously, but that they have a very fruitful plant and then can select out and perpetuate it in some way, and then for also other traits. So here we've got the mare's nipple grape from Central Asia, which is quite interesting. I did write in here Saparavi, which is one of the Georgian grapes. I guess it's grown up in the Ukraine too. It turns out this one is not so close to some of the earliest DNA evidence that we have from looking at modern cultivars and wild plants, but it is one of the Georgian varietals. So the thought then is that in the Neolithic period, we could have had domestication of the grape occurring. We've got domestication of lots of other plants and animals, and that would help to explain why we have the quantity of wine that we see at a small site like Haji Firuz. And Haji Firuz is in the zone of the wild vine. So this purplish area here shows where the wild vine grows today and presumably in antiquity. You see it doesn't extend down toward Egypt here. So when they came, we don't know the actual ancient distribution, but let's say the Lebanon is where the furthest south it would have come. And so up in this general area is where we have the possibility for the domestication of the grape. And here's that other site I mentioned with the grape seed, Shulivari, over in Georgia. Now, we don't know at Haji Firuz whether they were using domesticated or wild grapes. I mean, there's no way to know that yet, unless you were able to do some DNA analysis. But it is in the zone, so it's a possibility. And I showed some evidence from Georgia of very early pottery that maybe is related to grapes and wine. This is another possibility. And then Eastern Turkey is turning out to be really important, I think, for the early Neolithic period as a possible area too. So for instance, when they were putting in some of the dams along the Euphrates rivers, they came onto Neolithic sites that go back to 8,500 BC, 9,000 BC, which are much earlier than other sites in other parts of the mountainous Near East. And they even have, really spectacular architecture. in this case, some kind of a oryx bull, and then there's a fox here probably, and some sort of crane maybe here. But these are all inside buildings that they think could be some sort of religious shrine. I mean, in archaeology, of course, when you don't understand what something is, you assume it's got to be religiously oriented. Here's the back of a male head with a kind of strange serpent wiggling its way up. So, this area looks interesting. Now, they haven't reported from these sites any vessels that we could actually analyze. But we're in an area there that there is evidence for domestication of einkorn wheat genetically. And the excavators of these sites are suggesting that the reason the people were settling down or building these religious shrines, on a sort of long-term basis, is that they were exploiting the einkorn wheat to make beer. And this is one of the arguments you can make all around the world, really, is that people settled down for reasons of agriculture, to be close to their crops, to be able to take care of them and so forth. And in the process, they're starting to build small villages, and you get specialization as the process continues. So they don't have any actual vessels, though, that prove that einkorn wheat was used to make a fermented beverage. But Eastern Turkey does have other evidence for early founder crops, like there's bitter vetch, for instance, and so it's an area where we could have had the domestication of the grape as well. Now, this is the sort of question we've been pursuing: is was there a single domestication of the grape in one place, and then was it then spread to other parts of the world by transplantation and winemaking techniques going along with it? Or did you have multiple areas where it was domesticated? Maybe like the Spaniards, for instance, are very interested in having a separate domestication all the way in the western area of distribution of the wild grape. And you can refer to this as the Noah hypothesis, because after all, Noah was the first winemaker. When he got off the ark on Mount Ararat, the first thing he did was plant a vineyard and make some wine. Of course, there were some bad consequences that came out of that too. But this would be the idea that we do have a single place and time when the grape was domesticated, and then it spread out from there. And indeed, there are vineyards still growing on the sides of Mount Ararat, close to ancient sites. This is sort of like the Eve hypothesis, the notion that we have a single African mother. But it's a hypothesis that we would want to look at pretty closely. And one of the reasons we think that it may work is because we have a wine culture, as suggested by the pottery vessels that we've analyzed, the grape seeds and so forth, at Neolithic sites throughout this mountainous region. And that wine culture, and by wine culture I mean something that really dominates everybody's existence. Like when I was growing up in the Finger Lake region, we didn't have much good wine. We might have a sweet Concord, every so often. But look in the last 30 years, it's just taken off, and it just shows you, in the New World, and you can multiply, the Finger Lakes over and over again, to California, Oregon, Washington, Australia, South Africa, and so forth. Once wine, or any fermented beverage, really, for that matter, takes hold, it really can consume people and become a center of social relations and what have you. So it's fine dining and all the rest of it. So if we had evidence then for a wine culture of that sort developing in this mountainous region of the Near East, where we have the greatest genetic variability of Vitis vinifera, so this is often thought as the world center of the grape, of the Eurasian grape. And then that, in later periods, is spreading down to Egypt, first to the Jordan Valley, which is around 4000 BC. We have evidence there. And then on to Egypt around 3000 BC. The same thing's happening on the other side of the Fertile Crescent, going down to Shiraz by 3000 BC. It would seem as if we've got a domestication event occurring up here that then is spreading out and then ultimately spreads out to the whole world. And we've pursued this to some extent by trying to collect wild grape samples over in eastern Turkey. Now, I haven't, I've been asked by people in Iran to come over there and do some sampling, which we should do, but so far I've not done that. Eastern Turkey was maybe exciting enough. We went to the upper part of the Tigris River, which you see right here in eastern Turkey, and we just then scoured areas that there was no domesticated grape anywhere near these sites, but they were sometimes very difficult to get to. So here's my colleague from the University of Ankara on this very steep slope. In this case, I'm actually holding a plant that is a hermaphrodite wild plant. So it's one that the ancient humans would have had to select for to ultimately perpetuate. And it's in between a male wild vine and a female wild vine. So this is like the perfect situation for selecting. And unfortunately, though, this is an early spring, and this is like a raging torrent, even though it looks a little placid at the moment. And right after this picture was taken, and I stepped back, I almost fell into the river. And it was only the sure feet and shoes of my colleague here that sort of pulled me out. And I basically then had to, clamber up the side of the river to get to the top. In the process, I tore my pants and so on. But at least I'm alive here to tell you this story. So, so where did our DNA study lead us? Well, these are the groups that we used, European cultivars and wild vines. And you can have questions about what's really wild. I won't get into that too much. And then we had Georgia, represented Armenia and Turkey, some of our own samples. And then we don't have Iran very well represented, unfortunately. But the study that was published showed that using 20 microsatellites that it was the Near East that was where the domestication would have occurred. And in fact, there's a person here, used to be here at Cornell, Sean Miles, who I believe some people here in the audience know or have worked with, that did a single nucleotide polymorphism study, 9,000 of them, that also points to the mountainous Near East as where the domestication would have occurred. And what's kind of interesting here is that these wild European grapes don't overlap at all with the cultivated European grapes, and are much closer to the wild Turkey, and in some cases for Georgia, we see that the Pinot group is very closely related to some of the Georgian varieties. Now, I won't try to say their names because it's in our paper. Georgian is a pretty tough language, actually, and but once you have Pinot transplanted to Europe, it then seems to spread out into the Syrah group, and it really is kind of a key grape cultivar that develops. And then some of these Middle Eastern varieties, too, are closely related to Nebbiolo and Chasselas and so forth. So it really is pointing to a single domestication, NOAA hypothesis being substantiated in the Near East. And then it's going to be transplanted, like I say, down into Egypt. But I just wanted to say a few words about another site in Egypt. Now, I don't know if you can all see this. It's probably blocked out some, but there's a site of Abydos here, which is, we have a tomb from one of the earliest pharaohs, actually ruler Dynasty 0, who's been called Scorpion the First, that the German group, Archaeological Institute in Cairo, excavated. And the dating of the wine jars that we've analyzed from this site go back to 3150 BC. And this is what some of the jars look like. Now this is before the Nile Delta was planted with grapevines. It's around 3000 BC that we get the royal winemaking industry of Egypt developing. So 150 years or so before that, they have these jars that come and are deposited in a tomb of this pharaoh in Abydos out in the desert. So you have very good preservation. And there were 3 rooms that were filled with these jars, which is not an Egyptian type, you could say right away. And there were about 700 of these jars that had been brought. And they couldn't have wine that was made in Egypt because there was no royal winemaking that had been established yet. So where did they come from? And what could we say about them? Well, we did neutron activation of the clay of the pottery here, and it pointed to the wine originating from the Jordan Valley, or the hill country to either side of the Jordan Valley. And that's about 700 kilometers away from Abydos. So you have to imagine them filling up 700 jars, putting them on donkeys to get it overland, maybe on a boat, if such existed, bringing it up the Nile, depositing it in this tomb. Now, these other rooms were filled with beer vessels, clothing. The king was actually laid out here with a scepter. Recently we did some chemical analysis. We knew already that it was a resonated wine, but we thought we'd use some techniques like solid phase microextraction that would tell us more about the volatiles that might have been bound up in the wine. And it turned out that we had very good representation of, most probably, of herbs that also are found only in the Eastern Mediterranean, like thyme, savory, and these sorts of herbs, I think they fit into this ancient medicine picture. And so what we've done is gone ahead and started analyzing some of the compounds in the ancient wine for its anti-cancer effects. We've been working with the University of Pennsylvania Medical and Abramson Cancer Center. And what we call this is archaeological oncology, digging for drug discovery. And one of our Chinese beverages has a compound, I won't get into it today, but which knocks out all kinds of cancers. The Abydos jars were also interesting because they had some of the earliest long strands of DNA from Saccharomyces cerevisiae. Some of these are about 840 base pairs in length, which is quite unusual for such an early sample. Am I running out of time? Okay, well, let me just speed through here. I'll skip the spread of the grapevine over to Italy, as interesting as that is. It's a fascinating story of how probably the Phoenicians are the main carriers of the grapevine. And one of our projects that we're doing now is in southern France to try to figure out when the Etruscan wine amphoras came in, and that sort of jump-started the French winemaking industry as late as 400 BC. I mean, the French didn't really, to my opinion, did not have any wine. Even though we think of the French as being sort of the epitome of winemaking, it comes much later and it's brought from other places. This is the site that we're working on in southern France with its Etruscan amphoras spread out. And then I was going to say a few words about Cuevres, pottery, you could call it jug wines. And these are huge jars that they still make in Georgia and then are exporting those out to countries like Slovenia, Italy. And we're going to try, I guess, this afternoon some amphora wines. And this is a whole technique that we used to think it only went back to the Iron Age. This is an early site that was excavated in Armenia. Kamar Bleu. But the tradition of burying the whole jar underground, I mean, it makes sense maybe in terms of temperature control and so forth, but these jars are totally above ground. I mean, the amphora making here is not underground, and but the Georgian theory that they have a very early underground jar winemaking tradition got some substantiation from this cave in Armenia, dated to about 3000 BC, that had underground jars like this, where you could have run the juice right into them, and it was in a burial setting, so the wine might have been used even for offerings to the dead. So here's a qvevri, and that qvevri is just the Georgian term for an underground pottery jar, with all the materials rising to the surface. This is an Italian interpretation of how they handle the wine. So they would be, punching down the cap, and then you're getting lees here, and this wine is going to sit in that jar with all the skin, seeds, and what have you for 9 months until it's reopened, and you take off the stone here. But the advantage, I think, of the pottery is that it does exchange ions, or it can hold different compounds in place so that you can have catalysis, oxidation reduction, what have you, polymerization. But it depends a lot on the clay composition. In the Near East, we have terra rossa, which is very high iron, but in other places you might have something else. But I just like to contrast that with oak, because we think of oak as mellowing out everything, but it really introduces a whole series. It doesn't have the zeolite properties, the absorption properties, but it does introduce all these caramelization products, vanillin, lactones, and so forth. And so if you want a really pure varietal expression of terroir, you might better go with pottery, but that can be discussed. So here, I think, in a way, this whole story of the grape and the wine, it illustrates what biomolecular archaeology is capable of, and how much more we're going to really find out in the future. Here we've got a situation where one species gets domesticated and now is responsible for 99.9% of the wines in the world. It's quite an amazing story. And this whole story, I think, of civilization and wine is in a lot of ways, the history of civilization is the history of wine or fermented beverages, in which the grapevine is intertwining itself, and wine is being introduced into all these cultures, whether it's Provence in southern France or even sunny Ithaca. Okay, well, let's stop at that point. Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.